So, well, thank you very much, Thomas, for the nice introduction. And I'm going to talk about the nonprofit perspective on IPM and environmental stewardship. This topic was quite broad, so I thought I'm going to talk a little bit about the European Directive on Sustainable Use of Pesticides. And for that, therefore, I'm going to talk a little bit about the environmental risks and impacts, about the implementation of IPM, the dependency on the use of pesticides, and at the end then a little bit about the progress in reducing the risks of pesticides and other policy targets. So to start, pesticides, well, what are pesticides? They are substances that are intended for preventing, destroying, or controlling any pest, and it is just a term for a whole range of different substances. The most famous are probably herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides, and you can tell what they are targeting. But most pesticides, they are not, they do not only act on the targeted pests, but they do also have effects on non-target organisms and a whole range of indirect effects that then can affect the whole trophic chain. In plant protection products, these are the products that do contain at least one pesticide active ingredient. Many times they do contain more. And plant protection products are used in agriculture, and they are the largest chemical group that is actually voluntarily dispersed into the environment. And if we think about the fact that those products are designed to kill organisms, we better make sure that their use is, as minimal as possible and sustainable, if that is even possible. So for that, we have a Sustainable Use Directive in Europe, which was established in 2009. And it set up a framework to achieve the sustainable use of plant protection products by reducing the risks and the impacts of plant protection product use, by promoting integrated pest management in order to reduce the dependency on the use of pesticides. So what has happened to this Sustainable Use Directive? What has happened to risk reduction? Did we actually reduce the risk? Well, therefore, we can have a look at the harmonized risk indicators, which have been published by the European Commission 2 years ago in November 2019. The one on the left-hand side does show us the harmonized risk indicator 1, which does measure the use and the risks of pesticides. And the pesticides there are put into categories according to their risk. And it does show a decrease of 17% since the baseline period in 2011 to 2013. However, this decrease does not mean that we have used pesticides more sustainably. It could be purely due to the fact that there were authorizations ending and pesticides have been banned from the market that had a higher toxic profile. So it doesn't really tell us anything about the reduction in risk based on the use of pesticides. And when we look at the harmonized risk indicator 2, which is on the right-hand side, this gives quite a lot of reason for concern, because that is the risk indicator that does tell us about the number of emergency authorizations. And this one has increased by 56% since the baseline period. And emergency authorizations are always granted to products or substances that have been already banned from the market or substituted by others with a lower toxic profile. And therefore it is quite a big reason for concern. For instance, in Germany, we have a few emergency authorizations for sugar beet seed coating with a neonicotinoid. And we do know that neonicotinoids are brought into relation with pollinator declines at a global scale, because they do have sublethal effects. They do act on the behavioral changes, or they do cause disorientation and can reduce the queen fecundity. So that is a big reason of concern when we do ban pesticides and products from the market. And then there are emergency authorizations that can allow these products still to be used. So according to these results, there's absolutely no room for complacency there for the European Union, because the risk has not really been reduced for pesticides. So let's then look into the impacts of plant protection product use. Well, we know that we do contaminate our environment with pesticides. They can be found basically anywhere. So for instance, in water, when we do apply pesticides on agricultural fields with the rain, they can leach through the soil, reach groundwater and other surface waters next to those areas, such as small rivers or lakes. And the threshold levels that are actually determined in the regulatory risk assessment of pesticides that are supposed to not be exceeded in the environment in order to not have any unacceptable risks, they are actually exceeded many times, and that does occur 4 times more frequently in areas with high intensive agricultural use. So in 2018 and 2019, for instance, there were analyses in German water bodies where researchers found that in almost 2/3 of all the investigated water bodies, those regulatory acceptable threshold levels were exceeded. Going to soil, obviously we do apply pesticides mainly on soil. We find the same thing. We find residues of plant protection products, breakdown products, and the same thing as in water. We rarely do find pesticides as single compounds. We usually do find pesticides as mixtures. And that is a big issue because in the regulatory risk assessment, we usually do test the effects of single compounds and not of their mixtures. But we do know that when pesticides do get mixed, they can have very different toxicity to organisms and cause very different effects than what has been assessed previously in the lab. So when it comes to soil, a Europe-wide study, for instance, showed us that in 80% of the investigated soil samples, up to 166 different pesticide residues could be found. And many of these have been there for more than 10 years because they are so persistent that they just don't degrade in soil. And obviously they can remain active and cause effects for that whole range of time. So when it comes to the state of nature, we do know from the State of Nature, a report in the European Union, that pollution, so for instance, by pesticides, fertilizers, often do interact with other factors such as altered land use and habitat loss and fragmentation, and do cause biodiversity loss. So it is rarely a monocausal correlation. It is often a result due to the combination of more factors that do interact and add up. So there is a strong correlation between agricultural practices and the species richness and abundance. So where we do have more intensified agriculture, we often find less biodiversity. And half of the land area in the European Union is used for agriculture, so approximately 40%. And the conservation status of this habitat is, well, 81% of that is in a poor or bad conservation status. Only 15% is in a good conservation status, and about the remaining 4% we don't know. However, pesticides do not only contaminate our environment and have effects there, but they can also, well, accumulate in biota. So we know example from fish that they can take up from water pesticides and accumulate them in their bodies, or predator species do take up pesticides with their prey. And when it comes to pollinators, for instance, when we look at bee bread, which does mainly consist of pollen and is stored in the honeycombs of colonizing bees, it does serve as food for worker bees and the brood. If we analyze that for pesticides, we see, for instance, as in a study in 2018 in Germany, there can be a lot of pesticide residues. So in 120 out of 130 examined bee bread samples, researchers found a total of 44 fungicides, 21 herbicides, and 17 insecticides. So pollinators do get into contact with pesticides not only when they fly out to the field and take the pollen home, but they are already fed pesticides when they are in early larval stages. So pollinators potentially do get into contact with pesticides at any life stage. Also, when we look at bees that are not living in colonies, they often nest in soil, which is also contaminated, or a lot of pollinators do have larval stages that are aquatic, and we do have high residues of pesticides there potentially as well. So the effects are quite broad. So then it comes at no surprise that we have articles like this. This one is published by Hallmann and others. It was quite famous in Germany 3 years ago. I don't know if you guys in the US have seen this one, but it did state that over the past 27 years, there was a decline of 75% in the total flying insect biomass in protected areas, which is quite shocking. Similar trends have been seen also by Seibold and others, who has investigated species richness in grassland and forests, and he found a decrease of, well, average 30% for arthropods. When we do analyze papers or for the decline of entomofauna and what are the drivers for this, pesticides and in general pollution are very frequently, or almost in all of them, among the main drivers for the observed declines. And this is not only a problem, as I've said, for terrestrial systems, but also for aquatic systems, because pesticides do reduce also the regional biodiversity of stream invertebrates. And I could obviously go on with papers a bit more, but time doesn't allow this. So I'm going to quit this review of papers with an opinion of a lot of researchers who say that the biodiversity decline is also a consequence of an inappropriate environmental risk assessment of pesticides. There's not enough time to go into detail with that, but maybe we can talk about this later as well in the classroom. So I'll turn back to the Sustainable Use Directive and look into the dependency on the use. Has this at least been reduced if, well, the risks and the impacts are still there? When we look at the number of cells in the European Union, we can see that that was quite stable. So it is at approximately 360 million kilograms per year from 2011 to 2018. And when we look at the average use per area of cropland, here the dotted area is the European Union and below is US. You can tell that there was no real reduction, and the dependency has been quite stable from the use of plant protection products. And why is that? What has gone wrong with promoting integrated pest management? So this parameters show us the principles of integrated pest management, and we've already talked about that also. We've heard about it in previous seminars. So in a nutshell, it does tell us that farmers should only turn to plant protection products once prevention and all other means of non-chemical crop protection are not effective in order to keep the pest organism density below a specific threshold. So you need to do monitoring and check your pests before you do apply chemical control, and well, apply all the non-chemical methods before you do turn to pesticides. And what is the problem with the implementation of IPM? So there are a few issues with that. One of them is that farmers do have to make profit, and for them, often when they do a look at IPM, they first see how much will it cost me if I do apply pesticides, and how much will it cost me if I well, invest my time in non-chemical pest control, which is much more time intensive, and how much will it cost me if I take the wrong IPM decision and I risk to lose yield and therefore profit. Problem with this equation is that they do not take into account the costs that will occur for a loss of biodiversity, which will be a large cost in the long run. However, in the short run, they do not account these costs. So for farmers, it does often not seem very reasonable to implement IPM from an economic point of view. Then the second point is that Even though the European law does require farmers to apply IPM, and they do call for a more detailed specification of what those guidelines do even mean, the principles are not legally specified very often, and there is a lack of clear guidelines for farmers to apply for many crops. And that brings us to the third point, that farmers are often not, they do not have enough support with their IPM decisions, because IPM is a time, money, as well as knowledge intensive system. They need to know a lot about resistant varieties, about crop rotations, about all the phytosanitary measures. They need to know their pests, distinguish them from other pests or beneficials, know the enemies, know the reproductive rates, monitor the thresholds, so on and so on. And for those things, they would need the support and help from farm advisory services, but those are often understaffed. So there might be very often a lack of support for farmers, and therefore they do not implement IPM in the most ideal way. They also are not required to keep IPM records, which is a big problem because that is a quite crucial step in IPM. And when they do have problems with pests in the future, they rarely can turn to previous IPM records. And obviously, when the farm advisory services don't have enough staff, the control of IPM is quite weak, so they can't really enforce it because the controls are not enough. So to give you a few numbers, in 2013 in Germany, less than 2% of the farms have been checked, and in 2015, less than 1%. So the enforcement there is also a problem. And fourth argument here is that there obviously are some interests of people that the system remains exactly as it is, because when we look at the revenues of pesticides and other agriculture chemicals, we can see that there's quite a lot of money being made. So approximately $13.5 billion per year. And if IPM was implemented better and pesticides were used less, then obviously this would mean that industry would earn less money. So what has happened to the sustainable use of pesticides then? Well, there was a report last year from the European Court of Auditors where they assessed the success to reduce the risks related to plant protection products in the European Union, and about the action of the European Union in order to achieve those targets that were set. And the key findings were that there was a very slow start with limited progress in measuring and reducing the risks of the use of plant protection products until today. Still, there are very few lower risk products and alternative methods available for use to farmers. And they also found that the data that are collected and also made available is not sufficient in order to even allow an effective monitoring of the targets, of the risks, and about the pesticides that we have in the environment, because nobody really knows how much is there and what mixtures and what are the risks. And the last thing I said as well is that the harmonized risk indicators as published by the European Commission do not really show the extent to which this directive has achieved the successful the sustainable use of plant protection products. So in conclusion, we can say that business as usual is not an option, and IPM is a great approach, and it does incorporate a large range of practices. However, there is a lack of implementation that has to be solved. So what we need is very ambitious reduction targets that are actually met, such as those set, for instance, in the European Green Deal, which was published last year, and the biodiversity strategy, as well as the farm to fork strategy in the European Green Deal, do set the reduction targets of 50% of pesticide risks until 2030. However, those reduction targets are probably not achieved with appeals for more IPM, because that didn't work really much in the past. So what we need is that member states actually convert the general principles of IPM into practical criteria that can actually be performed by farmers. They need to set clear reduction targets at a farm level and set up regular controls and also sanctions when there is no compliance with IPM. Crucial for that is also an improved and independent and efficient farm advisory system with enough staff to support farmers in their IPM decisions. And a very important thing is also to link the implementation of integrated pest management to the payments under the Common Agricultural Policy, because that is the biggest pot of money in the European Union that should actually be used for biodiversity measures. And if that money was linked to the implementation of IPM, it could certainly help enforcing it and also financially support farmers when they do implement measures that do support biodiversity. So when it comes to the risks, what we must do is to actually identify them. So we need a better monitoring. We need to monitor our soils and take up all the substances that are being used. We need to quantify the risks, because if we do have risk indicators that are not appropriate or fit for purpose, then we can't really monitor whether we do achieve our targets and if we do reduce the risks. And the most important thing as well is that we actually do compensate the risk and manage the risk, because we do know that pesticides have an effect, because otherwise they wouldn't be authorized. So we know that there are negative effects and we need to compensate them. For instance, with non-cultivated areas, flower strips, fallow land, hedges or ponds that are free from the use of pesticides, that are not cultivated and that actually leave more room and refuge areas for pollinators and other organisms. So what we need is more space for nature. And according to studies, we need at least 10%, better more, of the agricultural area to be left without use. Unfortunately, in Germany at the moment, it's only 1.5%. And with that, I'd like to thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Verena. I have a really quick request. So I think a lot of us here at Penn State are probably unfamiliar with NABU or NABU specifically. I was just wondering if you could comment a little bit on like what services in particular your organization provides in sort of building an understanding of how to conserve insects and the environment through mitigating pesticide use and other things.
Well, we are quite a broad organization. We have different topics. So mine is especially on pesticides, but we do have other groups that do work on improving the Common Agricultural Policy, and that all, while we don't have any specific person working on improving pollinators, or I don't know specifically, Natalie, what the question was now.
Sorry. Oh, yeah, no problem. I was just kind of curious. I don't think many of us here in the States are familiar with your organization. And so I was just curious, you know, how you're providing this advice and information to the farmers.
So there are different projects around this. But at the moment, there is a project that is called Franz, but often NABU is just advisory to that.
Okay, thank you. And it looks like there are a couple of questions that we can address before moving over to Mace's talk. Looks like there's quite a few. I'll just stick with this first one that Christina submitted. It says, who supports the farm advisory services? Is this government, university, nonprofit, or industry? And so does the EU have an extension program like we do in the US?
Can I see those questions as well?
I think so. Yeah, there's a chat
Okay, I
feature.
see it. Okay. Well, usually farm advisory services are paid by government. So it is a government service. And that is the regular one. Then obviously there are also other farm advisory services provided by other institutions such as industry as well and nonprofit. So anyone basically can provide information on IPM, but the thing that is usual is that IPM is checked by a governmental institution.
So are these like, is that consistent across countries? Like every country will have their sort of farm advisory board, and then these are kind of operating at like province levels or something? What is like, just generally, like what does the structure kind of look like?
So in Germany, every region does have farm advisory services. And as far as I'm aware, also in other member states, that is the case. Yeah, I do suppose that it is governmental throughout member states. And yeah, however, industry obviously also has their own advisors.
Thanks.
Lauren Young has submitted a question as well. And she asks, are there currently, and I'm not familiar with CAP or CAP, but she wrote, are there currently any IPM payments for farmers under the CAP?
Well, as far as I'm aware, not really, because IPM is compulsory under the Sustainable Use Directive, and it is not linked to any CAP payments. So CAP payments do provide money for other biodiversity measures, but not strictly to complying with IPM.
There are some more questions coming in, but I would like to save these for the end of the session, if that's all right, and we will go ahead and move on to Mace for the time being.
That sounds good. Let's see. As I am queuing up my slides here, one thing Dr. Riedl mentioned is it highlighted a number of reports on declines in insects, biodiversity broadly, and it struck me because yesterday PNAS just came out with a special issue on this topic with maybe 8 or 9 different new studies or summaries on that. So I just put a link to that in the chat box for those who might want to go down that rabbit hole. There's a lot out there. So just putting that out there is something else for people to know about. Let's see. Actually, it's nice too. This is a good pairing of talks. I think this is what I'm going to talk about. It's going to nicely build on Dr. Riedl's presentation. And Natalie, do let me know if the audio, how the audio is coming through.
I can hear you loud and clear.
All right, excellent. Well, great. Well, thanks to all of you for the invitation to participate. This is a pretty exciting pairing of universities and efforts to come together here for this. I don't need to go into who I am. That was a great introduction. Thank you for that. But I thought I would start off with just a little bit more information on the Xerces Society, just under the assumption that particularly those of you in Europe might not be as familiar with our organization. So Xerces was founded in 1971 to work on the protection of wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates in their habitat. So initially, the bulk of our work was on butterfly conservation. We're named for the Xerces blue butterfly, the first US butterfly species to go extinct because of human activities. And so for the first maybe 10 years or so, we just did butterfly work. And when I joined the society in around 2000, 2001, there were 6 of us and only 1 person working full time. And now we've got 50 folks based across the country working on invertebrate conservation at a pretty meaningful scale. I'm pretty proud of this group. Our work focuses primarily on conservation planning, restoration, education, research, and advocacy, focus on obviously invertebrate protection. But we've broken our programs out into a number of sort of different kind of focus areas. And Natalie, can you let me know, are you able to see my pointer as I move it around on the screen? I'm pretty sure you can, but
Yes.
I just want to make sure.
Yep.
Okay, great. So the program that I help administer is our Pollinator Conservation and Ag Biodiversity program, but we also have a small team working on pesticide policy, regulation, actually pesticide risk management overall. I'll talk a little bit about that shortly. And then teams working on endangered species conservation, aquatic species conservation, and actually a new program that I should put in here, just focused on community outreach, trying to take all the lessons and the information we've gathered and get it out to a broader public. The team that I manage is now 22 staff based in offices across the country. And as you all learned from the introduction about my work, a significant part of this is a long-term partnership with the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service. So I and 10 other of my team serve as partner biologists, meaning that we are co-located in shared positions with the NRCS. And for those in Europe who don't know NRCS, this is the most important agency within the US Department of Agriculture that administers our equivalent of CAP. Oh shoot, even I just blanked on the name of CAP. The Common Ag Practices, or the incentives and technical support to adopt better agricultural practices in the US that are protective of natural resources. And I'll talk a lot more about that coming up here in a moment. And this team of folks, and I think this is relevant particularly when talking with graduate students who are looking at careers in, let's say, IPPM or IPM or even conservation. My team comes with backgrounds in restoration, ecology, research, entomology, farming, forestry, and ranch management, beekeeping, conservation, biological, pest control, IPM, and pesticide risk reduction, as well as native seed production, a very diverse set of skills layered on top of the entomology experience that most of my team have, really needing to bring a depth of knowledge and a wide range of different skills to be able to really effectively, I think, do our work at a national scale. So with that background, just on Xerces and kind of the focus, the group, I guess the team that I'll be sort of talking most about, I want to give a quick overview just of our pesticide work in general, which is a little bit outside of my team, and so work that I'm familiar with but not as directly involved in. And then I want to turn that focus to integrated pest and pollinator management, and the work of my team in terms of what we're doing to support IPPM, and then dig even more down a little bit more specifically to get into the Farm Bill and the conservation programs that we help administer and mechanisms to promote IPPM through these programs. And this is where we'll tie into the two publications that I got to you all to review and to look at, which really get at how do we what are some of the mechanisms and some of the guidance that we help develop to try to foster adoption of IPPM. So with that, let me just dive right into kind of our Xerces overall pesticide, perspective on pesticide risk reduction and pesticide work. And one of the big things that we have focused on over the last decade or more is really trying to be smart about choices. Banning products where, frankly, there are oftentimes in many cases where bans are totally appropriate, but some of the concerns that come up, whether real or not, and I'll get to that here in just a second, sometimes lead to worse options. And so we're constantly trying to think about what's going to be the best for invertebrates, biodiversity, for natural resources on the ground. And so even though in some cases bans may lead to other products and whatnot, it doesn't mean we're going to accept that we can be just applying pesticides without, I would argue, better consideration of risk. And so we're constantly thinking about alternatives, trying to develop alternatives, make sure those are in place, and really pushing for reduced risk by by fostering or encouraging more independent data and science, increased or improved risk assessment protocols, improved regulation. Actually, I've got a great example of this in a moment. Increased education, improved and expanded pest management choices. And the piece that we'll wrap up on sort of as my short presentation ties up here at the end, what are technical and financial support options available to help in the adoption of these different choices. And so we're constantly working around trying to hit all of these different angles when it comes to pesticide risk reduction, especially this focus on bringing some of the best data, best science to help us do that. So one example of this, or a couple of examples of this include a report that I worked on actually with David Bittinger, professor at Penn State University many years ago, just trying to provide an updated risk assessment on neonicotinoids, for example, and the potential impacts on bees. And this is, a publication that those of us, people out there who know Xerces and think we're, just sort of a purely an advocacy, conservation organization, which frankly, that is the heart of what we do. But many people, reported back to us when they actually took the time to read this report and the updated version, just how fair it was in terms of understanding the risk, understanding potential impacts of these products. More recently, the pesticide team, not my folks, but Xerces pesticide team, conducted an independent study of milkweed contamination by insecticides and fungicides, pesticide, kind of a little bit more broadly, documenting, extreme contamination of milkweed plants, which is a key host plant for the monarch butterfly here in the U.S., and, collected samples across California in natural areas and on farmlands, basically documenting, some preliminary evidence that there was no place in California where milkweed was not contaminated. Rangelands, natural areas, wildlife refuges, farms, backyards, and gardens, there was contamination everywhere. And so that sort of information is really important and useful and needed if we're going to understand how to manage risk at a landscape scale. Other work that the pesticide team has done include looking at, say, mosquito or rangeland grasshopper management, and how do we develop strategies that take into account reduced risk either to human health or to, let's say, rangeland, and balance that with impacts on biodiversity to, come up with the safest and the most effective ways to address those two concerns at the same time. And a lot of the work that our pesticide team does also focuses on both federal, actually I should add federal in here, federal, state, and local policies. We've generated a lot of some work with at the state and local level, promoting IPM policies and working with local municipalities and state governments to kind of foster the adoption of these different policies. And one big thing we're constantly working on is better regulation, particularly of neonicotinoid seed treatments. And this also came to a head yesterday. It was a big news day outside of all the big news that's out there in the world. A report came out in The Guardian about an ethanol plant that in Nebraska that was releasing huge amounts of neonicotinoids into the environment. Water contamination on site was at least 5 or 6 orders of magnitude higher than what's allowed by EPA. And this is because neonicotinoid seed treatments are not regulated as a pesticide, which means that seed companies or farmers or whomever who have extra seed that they need to get rid of, they could just ship it off to this ethanol plant. And there was no regulation for how that seed was disposed of. As a result, we've got at least one example here of an huge contamination event that led to Judy Wu, a professor at University of Nebraska-Lincoln, who reached out to us many months ago, just trying to figure out why her honeybees were dying at her apiaries outside of town. And so there is a need, a clear need, a common sense need to better regulate and manage risk when it comes to things like neonicotinoids. Anyway, just a little bit more background on the pesticide program. One other element of my program is our Be Better certification. I'm not going to go into depth on this. It was actually a toss-up between talking more about Be Better versus talking about Farm Bill conservation programs. But I did want to at least let you all know about this certification, which is really, we developed this and rolled it out a couple of years ago now as a tool to both recognize and reward the adoption of not just IPPM, but also pollinator habitat standards, a set of standards, trying to find that right balance of manageable standards around IPPM and reduced risk to pollinators, as well as meaningful changes in that. And part of it being meaningful is that having this be a third-party certification where an independent body, in our case, organic farm certifier called Oregon TILF, certifies these farms independently from Xerces. So we, with a team of advisors from research and industry and farming and NGOs, develop the standards, but then a third-party independent certifier certifies those farms. And to date, we have 20,000 acres that have been certified with reduced risk, pest management, and IPPM. So this is 18 different farm companies on 28 farms across the country. So just another tool for helping to incentivize and reward the adoption of IPPM. But I want to focus here for the rest of my talk on conservation provisions of the U.S. Farm Bill and talk a little bit about what that is and how this, sort of parallels the CAP in Europe and is a tool for providing technical and financial assistance on the adoption of IPPM. So for those who don't know the Farm Bill, this is a piece of national legislation here in the United States that's rolled out every 5 years or so that actually addresses a whole range of issues, from health and nutrition and research to safety nets for low-income households, job production, innovation, infrastructure development. But from our perspective today, there are hundreds of millions of dollars that are allocated through this piece of legislation to support conservation on working lands, so farm, ranch, and private forest lands in the United States. And this is done, I don't have time to go into great detail on how these conservation programs work, but the short of it is that through the Farm Bill, there are a number of programs. One of them is the Environmental Quality Incentives Program that fosters the adoption of a suite of specific practices that a landowner can choose. Ideally, this is done in the context of a whole farm conservation plan, where a USDA, a NRCS representative conservation planner comes out and works with the landowner to assess all the different issues on the farm. Soil conservation, water quality, habitat, wildlife, air quality, et cetera. They ideally give a farmer or landowner a sense of all of the issues that might be at play. And then that farmer can adopt on a voluntary basis different practices. And so one of those practices, and the one I'm going to talk the most about, has been renamed recently. It used to be called Integrated Pest Management. It really wasn't. And so there was a strong desire, which I strongly supported, to give it a new name. It is now called a Pest Management Conservation System. All these practices are given a code number, 595 in this case, and I'm going to use that as shorthand going forward for this Pest Management Conservation System. And each practice that could be adopted under the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, under EQIP, has a series of purposes. And one of the purposes of 595 is to reduce injury to beneficial organisms. And so part of my job is helping to foster, updating these practice standards, updating the support mechanisms for them. And it was, it's only in the last few years that we've been able to get something as specific as reducing injury to beneficial organisms into that practice standard. And so another new focus, or a slight adjustment to the focus of this practice, 595, in the last year or two, has been really to hone in on the kind of classic prevention, avoidance, monitoring, and suppression elements of IPM. So really helping people to clean equipment, focusing on pest-free seeds, irrigation scheduling to reduce pest risk, to prevent pest outbreaks or other pest concerns or disease concerns, thinking about pest-resistant varieties of crops, crop rotation, refuge management, and then a big push on monitoring, so scouting for pests and beneficials as well, trapping, degree day modeling, weather forecasting, and then when it comes to suppression, being very careful about optimizing application timing, using precision equipment, and I'll come back to this, sometimes substituting lower risk pesticides. I think one thing that I want to make clear about this, because we'll come back to this, to get financial assistance here, one has to document current states of practice and then the adoption of new practices that the farmer isn't already doing. And so that's just an important element of this that I'll come back to. So a farmer may be doing a lot of these different PAMS techniques, but needs to be able to document, hey, I'm going to add more sophisticated tools for monitoring, for example, and show that that is something that they haven't been doing, but that they want to move to. Now, there are a number of constraints around 595 and the pest management practice conservation system. One is the NRCS is not allowed to provide pesticide recommendations, and so as a result, they just don't have that expertise. I mean, these are generalist conservation planners at the field office level, and so it makes sense that they're not allowed to provide these recommendations and have to rely on cooperative extension or crop advisors or other independent folks. Another constraint is that if a chemical substitution, if we get to the suppression phase and you want to replace a higher, like let's say a higher risk product with a lower risk one, you need to document that that new product does not pose risk to aquatic systems, particularly drinking water quality and fish health. And so it adds additional layers that frankly are really just end up being very hard and complicated for the NRCS staff at the field office level to implement. So as a result, there tends to be less of a focus or a hesitation to focus on substituting lower risk pesticides. And so really as we look ahead, there's much more of a focus on sort of the PAM elements of IPM underneath this practice. So what are the opportunities? Through the NRCS, through these Farm Bill programs, there is the opportunity, it is possible to get financial support to adopt new IPPM practices on a particular farm, and an opportunity to really connect and bring together technical support. And I'm going to talk a lot about that. The challenges at play is that the NRCS doesn't usually have pest management experience at the ground level. And another significant challenge is that the NRCS and cooperative extension often don't speak the same language. So the advisors that might be available independently via, for example, universities like Penn State or other universities we work with like the University of New Hampshire, University of Maine, Oregon State University, they don't often speak the same language and the goals don't always align perfectly. With cooperative extension, there's much more of a focus on just effective IPM. How can we effectively address pest risks that a farmer is having around a particular crop in a particular region? Whereas the NRCS, the primary focus there is on natural resource conservation. So one of the things that I've spent a lot of time trying to do is look for where we have that overlap, where we can marry together effective IPM. And don't get me wrong, Extension wants to see a reduction on the impacts to natural resources as well, pretty much consistently across the board. But the bigger driver, the bigger driver in that effort is really, are we effectively managing pests? So that's where many years ago now, I started to work on this Agronomy Tech Note 9 that I handed out to all of you on preventing, it's the worst title ever, preventing or mitigating potential negative impacts of pesticides on pollinators using IPM and other conservation practices. And so this is actually in the process of being edited. And unfortunately, the newer version wasn't out yet. So I got you all this old version that uses the old practice name, Integrated Pest Management. And the goal here was to help identify kind of a 4-step process to really, to a certain degree, help NRCS staff understand how N595, the pest management conservation system practice, could be implemented to support IPPM. But frankly, it was almost more of meant to be a roadmap for farmers, for my staff, for extension, for others to be able to come together with NRCS as you'll soon see, to develop even more specific recommendations. So the heart of this document is just identifying a pollinator resource concern. And that's NRCS speak for saying, yeah, we're concerned about risks to pollinators and arguably other beneficial insects. So we want to take action on this particular farm, let's say, to reduce that risk. The next step in this process is to determine toxicity and persistence of pesticides being used, basically identifying, yeah, look, we've got insecticides that are bee toxic that are being used on the farm. So we need to pay close attention here and think about this. Then to move from that to thinking about potential exposure risk on the farm. And then once we've got an understanding of where and how, let's say, bees might be exposed, to develop that sort of risk prevention or mitigation plan to reduce that risk. And the heart of this document are really a series of tables in the back that, that provide basically sort of generic BMPs, best management practices, and our best estimates at a mitigation index value, that if you stack up a couple of these practices and get your mitigation index value high enough by adding these together, that we could say, hey, we're demonstrating at least a meaningful change in impact on the ground. And this is great. This was useful. A lot of people really responded well to this document. And particularly my staff found it very useful because they're thinking about pollinators or beneficial insects. They're thinking about this all the time and constantly helping farmers think about which of these different, let's say, mitigation practices or mitigation techniques might be appropriate. So for trained staff, it was really useful to be able to work with a landowner to try to figure out a plan. However, broadly across the United States and with NRCS, it hasn't been as useful. It's still a good framework, but what we've discovered, and this actually has its roots, frankly, with me working with David Bittinger at Penn State, most success around this practice, 595, comes from efforts that are both crop and region specific. Now, it's not IPPM related, but back in the early 2000s, Dave worked with his growers, his Pennsylvania apple growers down in the Biglerville, Gettysburg area, and his local NRCS office to come up with a very crop region specific concern and issue to bring more predatory mites into these orchards in a sustainable way in order to address mite concerns in the orchards. And they were able, through 595, to provide financial incentives to help growers in that region adopt the use of predatory mites and get paid some money to take action to bring mites into those fields. So it was a very local effort that brought together extension resources, researchers, the NRCS, and a grower community to support the adoption of a new practice. And so in my mind, this for me, ever since Dave and I, were working together back then, and he was telling me about what they were doing, this has been a framework that I've tried to bring to the NRCS for other parts of the country. So the example that I shared with you all, is actually a collaboration that started 2 or 3 years ago with the University of Maine, looking at IPPM and Maine blueberries, where we took the best management practices outlined in that Agronomy Tech Note 9, IPPM and Farm Bill programs, and really drilled down and brought together, Xerces staff facilitated bringing together University of Maine Extension, technical leadership from NRCS at the state level in Maine, and then our staff to put together a set of guidelines reflecting how to implement IPPM on blueberry barrens in Maine. And it's this collaboration with NRCS, Xerces, and Extension. And the heart of this, too, is just a series of practices, very specific practices, where a grower would need to go through working with either Extension or us or even the NRCS field offices at this point, because we could train those field offices on these practices to document what they're doing now, check, for example, if this is currently practiced, and then help them plan for the adoption of a whole suite of different practices. And then in so doing, be able to secure some sort of financial assistance for that work. And so I just pulled in just because I thought it'd be interesting to see what, for this fiscal year, for the current year, what would potential payments be for some of those practices. And if we look here, and I should have highlighted it and I didn't, but if we go down here to these lower lines, let's say that one is implementing either water quality pesticide mitigation scoring 30 points. Sorry, that's going to be confusing and distracting. That's sort of a set of different natural resource goals. But if we go to this side and or do implementing beneficial insect pesticide mitigation, at a lower level, let's just say at a 30-point level, and that relates to the number of points that one would score on a different program. But let's say we're looking at beneficial insect pesticide mitigation here, you could be getting on the order of $27 per acre for the adoption of that system. If you're going even a little bit above and beyond, and this is where I don't know how this dials in, say, for example, in Maine, but if you're achieving even more points than maybe a certain baseline, and again, I apologize, I don't know what that baseline is, you might even be able to earn $46 to $47 per acre for the adoption of those additional practices. And the HU that you see here and here, there's an additional payment and additional money available if you are a farmer from a historically underserved community. So women farmers, new farmers, Black, Hispanic farmers, farmers of color in general, they get additional payments above and beyond just the core practice to be able to cover those costs, and reflecting the fact that they've been historically underserved by agencies like the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So with that, I want to just, this effort, this crop and region specific effort is something that we're implementing in other parts of the country as well. For example, in tree fruit in Oregon with Oregon State University, and a growing program in apple orchards in New Hampshire. So we're trying to take this model and continue to expand it. We're also taking that Be Better model and working with NRCS to actually incentivize the adoption of Be Better. So certain states like California are particularly interested in that, where we've got almond orchards, for example, that may be hundreds of acres in size, that not only have adopted, let's say, habitat through the orchard, but really thought carefully about their pest management program and adopted certain standards that we've set up there. And NRCS is really excited about this as Be Better as a tool for documenting the adoption of IPPM and trying to figure out how they might provide financial incentives there. So with that, I think one thing that's important to recognize is that, when it comes to our work, what we need more and more of are experts who understand and value pollinator protection and natural resource conservation, but also crop production and pest management, because ideally we need to really bring these all together. And Dr. Riedl's sort of final slides, I think really I couldn't agree more that these need to be, independent experts. And this is something where I don't have time to get into it, but where the U.S., I would very much like to see and have worked to promote, actually even to Biden's transition team at USDA, how do we support an increased and independent cooperative extension, so that we have experts available who are looking out for farmers, natural resources, really trying to, not be beholden to an industry that's making money off of pest management, but really trying to think about what are the most sustainable, best ways to move forward. And with that, I think we'll call it good.
Thank you so much, Mace, for your talk. It's really, really good. So we have time for a couple of questions before the students who are taking the seminar series for credit will need to hop over. So we'll just do one quick question. And this is from Alex. It says, was this almond with a new strip of pollinator habitat from that image that you showed earlier?
Yeah, it was. So that was slough, a little wetland. Actually, Alex, you can picture that from your time in California, that we worked on the restoration of, and then put a 3-4 row hedgerow along the sides of it. All of that was new habitat in order for that farm to meet the habitat requirements of the Be Better standard. So yes, brand new, 2.5 miles long or something like that.
All right, and then really quickly, how many or what percentage of growers are applying for 595 funding to adjust their practices? So do most growers know about it? Like, is it widely adopted or very competitive?
Therein lies the rub. It's because the NRCS, because the field office level staff are actually quite uncomfortable and feel like they're out of their element when promoting it. It's not widely adopted. And it's been like part of what my team has been doing, has been trying to increase that adoption, let people know that it's available and how to put it to work. And we have new leadership, new in the last 2 or 3 years, within NRCS at headquarters, promoting kind of this sort of newer way to think about the 595 practice, and Pam's and Lindsay Haynes is in that position. She's also the organic lead for the agency. And so there's sort of more increasing push on this, but still, because of that challenge of local field office expertise and a lack of comfort, it's not getting promoted nearly as much as it potentially could. I will add one quick thing to that. There is a chicken and the egg element here, where over the last 15 years, 16 years that I've worked with NRCS, if growers come into an office asking about different programs or practices, that often has a positive feedback loop, getting, NRCS state offices to be more interested. And I remember I've talked with Ed Rajat at Penn State about this, and that goes back, talking with him 10, 12 years, and being involved with different state advisory committees. There's a state advisory technical committee that NRCS has, where researchers, for example, at Penn State can participate and also bring to those committees their interests and goals in seeing increased adoption of, for example, IPPM, and how could the state help facilitate that, or having stakeholders come to the table at a local level, and local in this case being a state level, is also something that helps.
All right, so we're going to conclude the webinar portion of this session. And so for those of you who are registered for credit, I emailed you the link to the discussion room last night. Hopefully you have that in your inbox, and we will see you all there. All right, see you in a bit. Thank you.